Okay, before we get back into our contracts material, something that I want to bring to your attention, and Darlene, thank you for bringing this to my attention. Darlene sent me an email yesterday about this Tegrity recording. It does not play. I've tried it in different browsers. Darlene said she had tried it in different browsers and on different devices. It does not play. If you try and pull it up in Firefox, it will say you need Silverlight, but chances are you probably already have Silverlight installed. If you bring it up in Edge or Internet Explorer, I think Chrome does the same thing. It will come up, except it just says it's buffering, and it never finishes buffering. Tried it on different devices, computer, phone, tablet. Nothing works. I've talked to the IT people here at school, and they have looked at it, and they can't figure out why it will not play either, because the other three do. And as you can see, from my perspective, looking at these three, I'm looking at these four, there's nothing that is different. You know, sometimes in the past, if one has been slow to upload, it'll say pending over here, but it doesn't say pending. I don't know why. That one will not play. I do not have an answer. I've tried to find one, but I've been unsuccessful. However, in the process of that attempt, I did get some other information, which is, please empty your hands of large, heavy objects. Tegrity will go away at the end of this month. I won't be able to use it anymore. It will no longer be supported. And I am guessing that my Tegrity link that gets me here will be removed from pause. That does give us until the end of the month. Not this Friday, but next week Friday, we are having a kind of an in-house training. Actually, we're having it for 3 days, but we're having a session on Friday about a new program that apparently the school is going to be utilizing that at least in part does lecture capture. I don't know anything about it other than to tell you I'm going to the session on it on Friday of next week. So as long as I can, I'm going to continue to use Tegrity. If I can find out more about this other lecture capture program, I will do that. If it is something that I can start using in July when Tegrity goes away, then I will attempt to do that. But right now, I have no information as to whether or not that will be possible. Okay? But anyway, I wanted to raise that because I know some of you rely on Tegrity. You go back and you listen to it and use it to review and those sorts of things. So I don't know. I mean, all I know is what they've told me thus far, so we'll just play it by ear, I guess, and do what we can. All right, any questions about that? All right, then let's get back into this one. This is where we were, and swap these two. All right, so last week we talked about offers, what is an offer, what is not an offer, what it requires. Then we started talking about that time between the offer and acceptance. One of those issues dealing with that time between when an offer is extended and acceptance is how an offer might die. We talked about a couple different ways in which an offer might die. One is through a lapse of time, that the acceptance is not completed in a sufficient amount of time to actually create a contract. We also talked about, come on, there we go. We also talked about the possibility of a supervening illegality, that an offer was made to create a contract with a legal subject matter. The offer was made, but before acceptance, the law changes, and now that contract is to engage in an activity that is no longer legal. That supervening illegality terminates the offer. We also talked about the possibility that either the offeror or the offeree dies or becomes insane. And I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. And as I recall, shoot, I changed that out. As I recall, we didn't really talk a lot specifically about Section 48 of the restatement. Section 48 has to do with communication. We did talk about the communication of, for instance, the death of the offeror or the offeree. I don't recall now if I mentioned specifically that in connection with Section 48, but that's what it deals with. The notification of the death is not required in order to terminate the offer. The fact that the death occurs is what terminates the offer, not the notification. All right, so that was where we stopped, and where we need to pick up tonight, let me back up here for just a moment, stick with this, is with the concept of the revocation of the offer. The revocation of the offer. What is revocation? It's the cancellation. It is when the offer or withdraws the offer. Who's the master of the offer? The offeror. The offeror, remember, is the master of the offer. The offeror is the one who gets to set the terms and the requirements. So if the offeror decides that, you know what, for whatever reason, I have no desire to enter into this contract after all, well then, that is typically the offeror's right to do so as the master of the offer. There does have, with revocation becomes effective generally when it is expressed to the offeree. So that if JC extends an offer to Kimberly, let's say during the break, and extends an offer, hey, I heard you talking about the Braves, I'll sell you my Atlanta Braves hat if you're interested. Okay. Sorry, JC, it's just hypothetical. No withdrawal pangs, please. Suppose JC says, I'll sell you my Atlanta Braves hat for $20. Just think about it, let me know. Okay. If that conversation happens during the break, and then during the second half of class, JC is back there thinking, oh, she's talking about acceptance. I said I'd sell my hat. Oh, wait, she's talking about the mailbox. Wait, I said I'd sell my hat. And all he can think about is parting with his hat, and he just decided now that it's too precious to him. Okay? So he doesn't want to sell it anymore. The offer's still out there until there is that communication to the offeree, in this case to Kimberly. So if Kimberly pulls out $20 from her purse soon as I shut up at the end of the night, and she runs back to JC and says, here you go, okay, well, there's not been any revocation yet because it has not been expressed. It's got to be expressed. It's got to be received by the offeree. Let me back up here a minute before I go to the next part. Again, there's a case that they don't include in your textbook, but there was a case about a paper company and what was the other one? A Motor Express company. It was a contract for the sale, or at least the discussion about a contract for the sale of a piece of land. And the paper company contacted the Motor Express company and said, we will sell, and I'm trying to remember now just how the offer went. I apologize, the Motor Express company delivered an offer to the paper company to buy paper company's piece of land. over time, there was some attempted communication that never came to fruition. About a month and a half later, the right people finally actually got on the phone at one time with each other. And the Motor Express company, the company that had said, we want to purchase your piece of land, during the course of this conversation said, you know, I think we're going to go a different direction. I don't think we're going to do something different. A week later, the paper company, the offeree, sent a letter saying, we accept your offer to purchase this piece of land. We will sell it to you, and we expect you to honor this deal. Of course, the offeror had decided to go a different direction and said, no, we're not selling it. There was a lawsuit. And the court said, you know what, look, there is no specific language that has to be used. The word revoke does not have to be used. But when there was this communication prior to acceptance and the offeror said, I think we're going to go in a different direction, that was enough to let the offeree know the offer is not on the table anymore. It's not something that can be accepted anymore. That was sufficient. That idea that there was a conversation that was at the very least inconsistent with the continuation of the offer. And that was enough for the revocation to be effective. Now, again, obviously that was expressed directly to the offeree. That's not the only way in which a revocation may occur. You may have revocation that is expressed indirectly to the offeree. Let's say, for instance, that Allison has a piece of land that she wants to sell, and so she says to Darlene, yep, I will sell you my piece of land for $15,000. Darlene says, yeah, okay, I appreciate that. Let me think about it, maybe see if I can get some financing up to get the $15,000, and I'll get back with you. Okay, that's fine. But in the meantime, Brian approaches Allison and says, I'll buy that land for you for $20,000. Allison says, all right, I will sell that land to you for $20,000. So now Allison has sold that piece of land to somebody else. Well, Brian and Jennifer happen to be chatting on the evening after the sale has occurred. Brian mentions he just bought that land from Allison. Jennifer says, well, that's a surprise because I thought Darlene was looking at buying that piece of land. And so now Jennifer calls up Darlene and says, you'll never guess what I heard tonight. I heard that Allison already sold that piece of land. Which point Darlene races to Allison and says, I got the $15,000, I'm ready to buy that piece of land. Okay? No, that does not work either. Even though Allison, our offeror, never went to Darlene and said, I think I'm going to sell it to Brian. Even though Allison never really even gave Darlene much of a chance, maybe, to get the financing together, there has been a revocation, even expressed indirectly to the offeree. Courts will still recognize that as a revocation. And that revocation, of course, means that not only does the offeror withdraw the offer, but it takes away the possibility of acceptance by the offeree, because there is nothing left to accept anymore. Our offeree is now powerless to try and make that contract a reality. Now, I mentioned that the revocation is effective when it is received. It's got to be received by the offeree, and it doesn't matter whether it's directly or indirectly expressed to the offeree. What's one of the primary ways we communicate today? We text, we email, okay? I don't see those trends changing anytime in the near future. So if, let's say, for instance, let's go back to my first hypothetical, JC selling his hat to Kimberly, and he's sitting there in the second half of class, and he finally comes to the realization that that hat means too much. He's not going to sell it. So rather than waiting until the end of the class, because it's distracting him, he keeps thinking about his hat, he gets on his email, and he sends an email to Kimberly during class. Sorry, not going to sell my hat, can't part with it. Kimberly is paying attention in class, taking notes, listening to the hypotheticals, making sure that she's got the information down. She's not paying any attention to her email. Has she received the revocation? Yes, even though she's not opened the email. Anybody else think differently? She hasn't read it yet. She doesn't know about it, right? As far as she knows, when she's thinking about acceptances and when and how they are accepted in the mailbox rule, she's thinking she's going to buy a hat at the end of class.
Well, with your hypothetical, there wasn't an acceptance. You just said, let me know.
Right, there hasn't been any acceptance yet, so there is no contract. But has the revocation been effective, even though the email is sitting in her inbox, not having been opened? Courts have said we don't care whether or not the recipient has opened that email. Because otherwise, you give all the power to the offeree at that point. Because when you pull up your email, at least I know when I pull up my Southwest account, I can see who sent it, I can see the topic that the sender identified, and I can also see, 20 words or so of the beginning of the content of that email. What if I decide, I want to buy that hat. Kimberly wants to buy that hat. She didn't want to hear anything about any revocation. Forget it. She wants to buy the hat, so she's going to ignore that email. Well, who has the power now? Kimberly does. She has the power of saying, I'm going to ignore the offeror's revocation. Courts won't allow that. It's the offeror's offer. If the offer wants to revoke, the offeror has that power, typically. And if that is expressed, it is then the offeree's responsibility for, again, engaging in that reasonable behavior, to open the email, to read the text, to see, oh, crud, offer's been revoked. Yeah, Lakianti.
Okay, so what if after class, his intention is to revoke the offer, but she comes to him, or he can come to her and is the contract?
No, because if he sends the email during the second, if he doesn't send the email, if she accepts before he expresses that revocation, yes, she can accept, because he has left that offer out there. But if he sends the email, once he sends the email to her, then the revocation is effective, even if she has not opened the email and read it. Okay? Yeah, Kimberly. Too late. Yeah. Too late. Yep. And I will say too, some of the rules that are utilized in the area of contract law were created. Rules like this idea that revocation is effective when expressed, when received by the offeree. We'll talk about rejection and when it is effective. We'll talk about the mailbox rule. These rules were developed when primary modes of communication were snail mail, maybe telegrams. But rather than typically throwing those rules out and saying, oh, well, we don't communicate that way anymore, what courts have done is they have worked with our modes of communication as they have evolved and just then found ways for those rules to work. So that's why, because if you think of a snail mail letter, it can be sent to a mailbox, it can be taken inside the house, and I can tell you right now, I've got way more pieces of mail unopened in my house, primarily because they all say, give us money, right? And I'm ignoring them because, another charity, another charitable organization saying, we need money, help send us money now. Yeah, right, I'll get to that one of these days. So it just sits there unopened, okay? That being said, I have received that information. It's the same idea here with revocation. If it is made available to the offeree in a reasonable way, then that is going to be effective communication, even if the offeree doesn't take the time and the effort to actually get into that communication, whether it's through snail mail, whether it's through email or text, that sort of thing. That's all right. Now, I have tried to be very careful to say, typically, the offeror has the right to revoke the offer. That's because there are a couple important exceptions to this right to revoke. A couple important situations where the offeror cannot revoke an offer. One of those exceptions is with what we call an option contract. An option contract. What's an option contract? What's an option contract? You would think because I call it an option contract that it would be optional. Actually, that has nothing to do with being optional. In fact, an option contract, to a degree, takes the uncertainty of options away. An option contract is a contract that creates an irrevocable offer. It creates an irrevocable offer. So an option contract, if it is entered into, means that the offer will remain a viable offer for some period of time. And whatever that period of time is set by the option contract itself. Now, this is a contract, which means that it must have the essential elements of a contract. What are those essential elements? Offer, acceptance, and consideration. So an option contract must have an offer. That offer must be accepted, and there must be consideration. We are not talking about the main contract. We are talking about the option contract. Okay? The option contract, to create this irrevocable offer, must have its own offer, must have its own acceptance. It must also have its own consideration. Oops, not that yet. It must have its own consideration, separate and apart from the consideration of the primary contract. For example, let's say, for instance,
So this is a secondary contract?
I wouldn't say secondary, excuse me, but I would say a second contract, okay? So let's say, for instance, that Charles decides he wants to go car shopping. And he's car shopping, and he's looking at cars, and he's, oh, Charles, I'm going to put you in a Chevy Equinox. I can just see you tooling around in Equinox. All right, so he's on the Chevy lot, and he's looking at that Equinox, and it's a pretty beige color that he just can't pull his eyes away from, right? And so he's talking to the dealer, and the dealer says, I tell you what, I'll sell you this Equinox for $25,000. Charles says, that's a little bit steeper than I can go. I don't think I can do 25. Can you come down? Charles says, in fact, I tell you what, I'll pay you 18. The dealer says, no, I can't do 18. They finally come together, and they decide that Charles wants that Equinox. He can pay $20,000. He likes that color, likes that car. But let's say Wednesday afternoon, he knows he's got to come to class. He's got to work tomorrow morning. Look, Charles says to the dealer, it's going to be a couple days to make sure, see if I can get a loan, talk to whoever I got to talk to. Could you give me a week? Give me 1 week to secure the financing, make sure I've got everything in order, and I'll come back and pay you $20,000 for this vehicle. Okay? Dealers never really like to let you do that, but the dealer says, man, I gotta move this car, I gotta talk to my manager. So Charles says, I tell you what, I will pay you $500 for an option contract. And that $500 means that Charles has 1 week to come back and pay $20,000 for that vehicle. He has 1 week that he is paying $500 for. Okay? Charles' offer to the car dealer is, I'll pay you $500 if you keep this offer open for me for 1 week. The acceptance by the car dealership, by the car dealer is, I will give you 1 week to allow you to do whatever you need to do to come back and buy this car. Decide if you want to come back and buy this car if you pay me $500. We have an offer, we have acceptance, and we have consideration being provided by both parties. $500 and 1 week. Charles comes back within that week and says, I've got it, I've got the money, I can pay you $20,000 for this car. Does he pay $20,000 or does he pay $19,500? He now has to pay $20,000 because the $20,000 is the consideration for the car. The $500 is the consideration for the week. That $500 paid for the option contract does not go toward the consideration of the primary contract. Didn't pay anything toward that car. That $500 bought time. Okay? Does that make sense?
Looks like how you write the contract up. You write it up for $20,000, just write the contract up for the car for $20,000.
Okay.
The sell car.
Which one? For the sale of the car?
Right.
Okay. So the auto dealer would be writing up the offer. Okay. Now the offer does, but I want to be specific here because of the steps that this takes, because we don't have a contract yet for the sale of the vehicle.
Okay.
Because
When it happens, when he comes back and
Mhm.
he verbalizes to the auto dealer that I want that Equinox,
yes,
then at that time the auto dealer will write up that contract for $20,000.
yes,
However, that $500, I mean, it's like it's
gone.
but it's going to the auto dealer in some form. I mean, how is that? I guess I'm trying to. How is that wrong up? How is that?
Because we have two separate contracts.
Okay. All right.
Because we have two separate contracts. Now, the option contract allows this offer to remain open,
Okay.
to remain acceptable, and I mean, in terms of let me put that differently, it allows this offer to remain open to acceptance for a period of time. So, I'm sorry, I just kind of lost my train of thought there and where I was going. But yeah, these are two separate contracts. This offer is going to be open for this 1 week for the $500.
So at the time the option contract was put into place, then was it signed by both parties?
The option contract, it doesn't have to be, and I say that only because off the top of my head, I can't think of a situation when an option contract would have to be in writing.
Okay.
It may be an oral option contract and still be enforceable. Okay? Okay. Now, let's see, where should I go next with option contracts? What is that third point there? If, let's say, for instance, that this is, let's go back 1 week. This is on June 7th of 2018. Charles and the dealer enter into this option contract for 1 week. If on Friday, Charles calls up the dealer and says, I thought I was going to be able to do it, I thought I was going to be able to pull it off, but I can't get the money together, I'm not going to be able to buy the Equinox. Okay? Now, the terminology that we'll get to here a little bit later tonight is that is a rejection of an offer. If Charles calls on Friday and says, nope, sorry, can't do it. What about our option contract? Still in effect. So what happens if on Monday, let's see, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday would be the, I don't know, today's the, say the 13th? So Monday would have been the 11th. If on Monday, Charles calls up the dealership and says, great news, I talked to my grandpa. I didn't think my grandpa would come through, but he has. He's willing to give me this loan on really great terms. I have decided I want that Equinox after all. Can he now force the auto dealer to sell him the Equinox at the $20,000? Why? Because he called and he said, I don't want it anymore. What if they sold it over the weekend? The option contract is in effect for 1 week. And even if Charles rejects during that week, it doesn't stop the option contract. The option contract continues to run. And Charles has the time that he paid $500 for to accept that offer. Because you wouldn't want the car? No. Oh. Damages might be a little difficult, but yeah, you can sue him. That's for sure. You can sue him. But yeah, because with that option contract, even if there is a rejection, the option contract doesn't stop. Whatever time was purchased, that's how much time the offeree has. Okay? You can think of it as a price lock, you can think of it as protection, because, you know, what happens if between the time that Charles talks to the auto dealer and between that time and when he's able to gather financing, what if there's a run on those Equinoxes? Now everybody wants one, and Charles wants to make sure that he has one, and, you know, because he thinks he can make it work. whether you think of it as protection or you think of it as a price lock, it sets that offer into place. And I'm just go ahead, I'll come back to the transferability issue. When you have an option contract in place, it really is almost unkillable. I tried to think of a better word to use, but I couldn't really come up with one that I liked, so if you have a suggestion, I'm more than happy to consider it. But the idea here is that once that option contract has been created, the offer that is protected for the period of the option contract, not killed by a rejection. It is not killed by, trying to think, we talked about lapse of time. It's not killed by a lapse of time until we get to the end of the option contract, okay? Then, once the option contract has run out, then that lapse of time will come into place and kill it. It is not terminated by a counteroffer. It's not terminated by a revocation because the revocation, the power to revoke, has been given up for the period of the offer. It's also not terminated by the death of the offeror. Okay, the death of the offeror. Now, when you're talking about an auto dealership, death of the offeror is not really a significant thing. But let me go back to my earlier hypothetical with JC selling his hat to Kimberly. Suppose that they enter into an option contract. Kimberly says, I'm going to pay you $5 if you give me until next week Wednesday to decide whether or not I want to buy your hat. And I don't know that I'll kill off all of you in a hypothetical by the end of the semester, but I do apologize for killing off some of you. Suppose that, heaven forbid, JC dies between now and next week. Okay? Well, guess what? There is an option contract in place that gives Kimberly a week. And if Kimberly decides within that week that she wants to buy his hat, she's got the option contract, she can go to JC's estate and say, here's the money, I want the hat. Okay? Hang on a second. Yeah, Chevelle. Yeah. You want his hat? Chevelle?
But she still owes $20.
Yes. Yes, because there's still the consideration for that primary contract. Yeah. There are a couple things. There are a couple things that will kill an option contract, and one is that idea of the lapse of time. When the life of the option contract ends, then the option, of course, is gone. Okay, but I mean that's just inherent in the option contract. Somebody is buying time, and that time will end at some point. So that is one thing that can kill an option contract. Really, about the only other thing that kills an option contract is supervening illegality. That idea that when that initial offer is made during the life of the option contract, the law changes, and now this offer is an offer to engage in an illegal activity. The court won't enforce that. Yes?
Will they get their money back for the option contract?
I am not aware of any cases that have addressed that issue. So my answer is just kind of a best guess, quite honestly. But whether or not the money could be returned in that situation, I think would probably depend on how far into that time that the option has gone. But even then, well, let's say, for instance, that the offeree says, your offer's really enticing. I want to think about it. I want to make sure I have a sufficient amount of time to think about it. So I want to buy an option that will last for the next 3 months. And I am going to pay you $10,000 per month, so a total of $30,000 to keep this offer open. And 2 days later, the law is passed that says this is now an illegal activity.
No reason.
Well, and there is the part of contract law which can be very harsh and say, sorry, you paid your money, you entered into the deal, you can't have your money back. But one of the things that we're going to get into tonight are some ways in which courts try to avoid those harsh results, where someone paid $30,000 for something that they can no longer make use of anymore. Not because anybody did anything wrong, but because the law's changed. My suspicion is in a situation like that, the laws are probably going to try and return most of that $30,000. Again, because it's not due to anything the parties did. But again, I think it would depend upon the circumstances. I can't envision situations where the courts might say, sorry, but you lost your money.
My thinking is the seller didn't know it was going to become illegal. And he was expecting that money. And as soon as it became illegal, he could have sold it before then.
Well, and that's why I say I think it would depend upon how far into the option contract they were. If it happened 2 days in, there's really not a lot of time for the seller to have taken other actions while it was still a legal activity to engage in. But if, let's say, we're 2 months into the 3 months, and the offeree wants to say, well, where's my $10,000 back because my time actually only bought 2 months, then I think that's a much more, that's a much stronger argument to say, look, I could have sold this. I could have done this 2 months ago if not for this option contract. So not my fault the law's changed either. I should be entitled to all of the money for the option contract. It would be an interesting question to see how courts would work through that aspect. I will say, well, that's all right. We won't go down that. Any other questions that I can equivocate and guess at answering? Okay. Let's talk about the part of the option contract that I skipped over, and that is this idea that an option contract is transferable, that it is transferable. It's one thing about option contracts that they are generally transferable, so that if Brian buys an option contract to purchase, what do you want to buy, Brian? Okay, so Brian's thinking about buying a house. He buys an option to keep the offer open. And again, this is one of those situations where if he has the option, that means that the seller can't sell to anybody else. It's not like they've got 5 that are exactly the same in exactly the same spot. Can't do that with homes, okay? So Brian buys the option. It's going to last for a month. 2 weeks into the month, Brian realizes, I'm not going to be able to buy this house. But Brian's best friend, Shavella, says, I've been with you to the house. I like the house. I like the neighborhood, good schools, not a lot of traffic, good neighbors. Brian says, well, I tell you what, I will sell you my option. At which point, Brian, and he doesn't have to, he may transfer it. If somehow that option transfer, that contract rather, is now transferred to Shavella, Shavella now has the ability to go to the seller and say, I am exercising this option. Even though Shavella wasn't the one who paid the money to the seller, she has gotten the option from Brian. And she can now exercise that option. Because
You have a workaround. Like if someone has poor credit, they go to their friend with high credit and say, hey,
Typically not, because Chevelle is still going to have to arrange financing. Okay, so if let's say Brian's got great credit, Chevelle has got horrid credit, what financial institution is she going to get the money from to lend her to purchase the house? Now, if the option contract is on an offer that is for a self-financed situation, then yeah, the seller may be in a little bit of trouble, because if, again, let's say the seller entered into the option contract with Brian thinking, oh, he'd never stop paying, he'd never miss payments, he'd never go bankrupt, he's never going to do those things because he's got good credit. And now all of a sudden that option is being presented by someone who has horrid credit. If the seller was in a self-financing situation, then the seller's now in a world of hurt.
I meant more along the lines of like the top-off price, like with the Equinox.
Mm-hmm.
You said it started at $25,000. What if you just sent your friend in there who's a good negotiator? They talked him down to like really low compared to what they would do,
Mm-hmm.
and then he's just like, yeah, I'll buy an option, and then just immediately went and gave it to a friend because the cap price is set. It's not about the final.
In those situations, when you've got someone who is in effect acting as an agent for somebody else, there become some issues about that question, because that's really, in your hypothetical, that's what you've got. You've got someone acting as an agent, but as an undisclosed agent. What is referred to as an undisclosed agent, because the buddy walks in who can negotiate, get the price down low, walks in knowing, hey, I'm never going to buy this car. I don't want to buy this car. I'm just trying to get a good deal for somebody else. Courts do not recognize transfers of those option contracts as willingly as they do when it's a different sort of situation, like, Brian initially was genuinely interested, and then was not during the term of the option. In particular, courts will not enforce a transfer if the seller, if the offeror has made it known, I'm not dealing with that person over there. I don't want to extend my offer to that person over there. I will extend my offer to you, because remember, the master of the offer is the offeror. And so if the offeror wants to say, I'm not selling to you, but I'll sell to you, that's the offeror's choice. And if, as a way to try and get around that, there is this kind of undisclosed agency activity where one person says, well, I'll go in and act like I am, and then I'll get an option, I'll come back and I'll give it to you.
What about a disclosed agent?
In a disclosed agency situation, if the person presenting him or herself to the seller, to the offeror, says, I am here on somebody else's behalf, courts will generally uphold that transfer of that option. It was put up front. And if there are concerns of, well, I want to make sure the person that I sell to has a good credit rating, those things then need to be explained, and they need to be worked into that option. Okay? Any other questions about option contracts? Now, these are option contracts that the parties are very conscious about entering into, that they intend to enter into. There is also the possibility of what the law calls an implied option contract. Implied, meaning it's not something that the parties intentionally enter into. It's not something that is clear and is stated by the parties. An implied option contract is created when the courts say it is, quite honestly. But when you have the situation where the offeree's reliance on the offer is the consideration for the period of time that the implied option contract is created. Let me say first, before we get to that, an implied option contract is not recognized under classical contract theory, because an implied option contract is something that the courts impose on the transaction by the parties. And if classical contract theory is the law that is applicable to a particular situation, no implied option contract. You want an option contract, you create one, you create it specifically. The courts will not do that. Oh, okay, so there's that. And now, that being said, we do have the restatement. And the restatement has a couple different ways of recognizing this implied option contract. One of the ways is here in section 45 of the restatement, and I want to talk about the test here for just a moment because it is relevant to this discussion. Most of you have had me before, and so you know that generally I don't have questions on a test that would say match this rule number to this concept or this statute number to this rule. Because typically I say I'd rather have you understand the content than those rule numbers. With these different restatement sections, because we're going to talk about a few different restatement sections over the course of the evening, paying attention to the numbers, these section numbers, is important. Because as you'll see, even here with this idea of an implied option contract, different sections of the restatement may have a different impact depending upon the transaction and the situation. And this will become even more evident here in just a minute. If you remember, when we were talking about the Chapter 2 quiz at the end of last week, and we were looking at the question, I don't remember now what the question was, but Lecantia was saying, but wait a minute, it says right here, see, there's this example in the textbook about the farmer and Simon and painting the barn. This is why I said this was the right answer, and I said, oh, right, that's because the question was really being asked in terms of section 45, this next section we're going to look at the restatement. I don't know because I haven't gone back over the test for next week. I haven't made changes to it that I'm going to need to make to it. But I cannot say specifically there would not be a question that would say, under section 45 of the restatement of the contracts, and then give you a scenario, okay? So it's important to pay attention to these section numbers. I wish there were another way for me to do it so that the numbers themselves were not important, but there's just not a way around it. So I'm suggesting that you keep those numbers in your notes and in your study as you're preparing for next week. All right, so let's look here at section 45 of the restatement of contracts. First of all, where an offer invites an offeree to accept by rendering a performance, what kind of contract is that? Unilateral contract. The offeror is not asking for a promise. The offeror is asking for performance. We haven't gotten to acceptance yet, but acceptance of a unilateral contract does not occur until performance has been completed. So you get the situation where they talk about in the textbook about Simon being offered a unilateral contract, I'll pay you money if you paint my barn. Simon paints 3 of the 4 walls of the barn, at which point the farmer revokes and says, sorry, I changed my mind. I'm not going to pay you after all. Okay? Under classical contract theory, the law says no contract because there has not been any acceptance. Acceptance requires full performance. We don't have full performance. Section 45 tries to lessen the harshness of that determination. Section 45 says when you have a unilateral contract An option contract is created when the offeree tenders or begins the invited performance. So under Section 45, the idea here is that Simon, the painter, is the beneficiary of an implied option contract when he is painting the walls, even though he's not finished yet. He has an implied option contract that gives him a reasonable amount of time to complete performance. Go ahead.
Okay, so are you saying with any offer that this is implied? Like,
This only applies to a unilateral contract.
that requires a form?
I'm sorry, I should state it differently. This only applies to an offer for a unilateral contract, okay? Because we don't have a contract yet. We don't have a contract until there is full performance. The idea here is once somebody starts performing, because they want to have this contract, they want to enter into this contract, they are trying to accept the contract. The restatement here under Section 45 says, we're going to protect you and give you a reasonable amount of time to complete the performance, to create the acceptance, so that you can go ahead and start. And then again, because it's an option contract, it takes the power. It's an implied option contract, but it's still an option contract, so the idea is the offeror loses the power to revoke.
So that the offer cannot, in any situation, because of this, they can't just revoke when somebody almost done with it.
If it's an offer for a unilateral contract, yes.
That was the question on the test about swimming the English Channel.
That's what it was, yeah. Yes,
Done, he yelled out, no.
I revoke. Yeah, yeah.
You wouldn't have been able to do that.
Yes, under Section 45 of the restatement, the revocation would not have been effective. There's and I will say, I really tried hard to try and find the actual case. I could not find the actual case, but it's a story, at least, at the very least, it's been around for a long time, is that there was this guy who's Jimmy the Human Fly, and he climbed buildings in the early 1900s. And the story is, and I think there's a reasonable amount of validity to it, but anyway, there's a story that there was a guy who owned a tavern that was near the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., and the tavern owner wanted to generate some publicity and some attention to his tavern. So he told Jimmy the Human Fly, if you climb to the top of the Washington Monument, I'll pay you like $10,000. Early 1900s, that was a heck of a lot of money. And so sign date, sign time, Jimmy the Human Fly shows up and he starts climbing up to the top of the Washington Monument, and he gets about 3/4 of the way up, at which point the tavern owner says, oh, hey, by the way, Jimmy, I revoke, okay? Because it was an offer for a unilateral contract. And under classical contract theory, the offeror can revoke any time prior to the creation of the contract, unilateral contract, any time prior to full performance. And Jimmy sued and got his money, his $10,000. Under this idea, I don't remember if they had the first restatement around at that time or not, but under this idea that this implied option contract should be imposed, really, and it's an idea based in fairness. It's an idea based in fairness, because if an offeror is going to require full performance, there needs to be some way to allow the offeree to get to full performance. And so that's what you have here under Section 45. Now, as Section 2 here says, the offeror's duty, meaning typically the offeror's requirement to pay or to do whatever it is the offeror is going to do, is not created. It is conditional until there is complete performance. So if Simon paints 3 walls of the barn and leaves and never comes back, well, now the farmer no longer has a requirement to pay. The power to revoke comes back to the farmer because Simon had his chance to finish painting the barn and he didn't do it. So it's not that now the farmer can't enter into a contract with anybody else. If the offeree stops before full performance is completed, then the implied option contract goes away. Now again, what we start talking about is what is a reasonable time to fully perform and that sort of thing, and that's going to be a part of the evaluation. Now, this is for a unilateral contract. There are, of course, bilateral contracts that may have an implied option contract if, and again, this is section 87.2, if 87.2 is applicable to this situation. So 87.2 talks about an offer which the offeror should reasonably expect to induce action or forbearance of a substantial character, and part of action does induce, which does induce action or forbearance. We started talking about bilateral contracts. Is this limited to bilateral contracts? You know, remember, let me come back here. There we go. Section 45 specifically says when an offer invites an offeree to accept by rendering a performance. So the language in section 45 specifically makes it limited to unilateral contracts because it talks about accepting by performance. Under 87.2, is it limited to bilateral contracts? There's nothing in 87.2 that limits it to bilateral contracts, and in fact, 87.2 is applicable to both unilateral and bilateral contracts. All right, now with that understanding, let's look at what it creates in these situations. An offer which the offeror should reasonably expect to induce action or forbearance of a substantial character on the part of the offeree before acceptance. So the idea here is that the offeror is putting out an offer, and the offeror should reasonably, objective standard, not subject, but an objective standard, objectively, a reasonable offeror in this situation would understand that the offeree is going to start taking some action or maybe stop taking action because, hey, I got this offer out there. I haven't accepted yet, but I want to, I intend to, so I'm going to do some things before I do actually accept.
So, going back to your painting example, with Simon buying the paint, even though he hasn't started painting, he's taking the steps to prepare for painting.
Yes, because the idea here is, where is it? The idea here is that Simon only purchased those paints because he intended to accept that offer to paint the barn. And even if, let's say, for instance, the farmer calls up Simon, doesn't get him, but leaves a voicemail message. Hey, I know you do some painting. I need to have my barn painted. And even if, whether it's I will pay you $500 to paint my barn, if you paint my barn, or I will pay you $500, I promise to pay you $500 if you promise to paint my barn, whether the offer is for a unilateral or bilateral contract. Simon gets that voicemail later that night, doesn't have a chance to talk to the farmer, but goes out and buys paint. There's not been any acceptance yet, whether it's a unilateral or a bilateral contract, but Simon has still taken actions so that he can accept and perform the contract.
Like kind of like them building a deck and getting the supply
Yes,
beforehand.
yes. They went out and, if you've got a contractor who purchases supplies to build that deck, even though they haven't accepted the offer of the homeowner to build the deck yet, they are taking actions in light of the offer that was made. Yeah. And in those situations, again, what we have is an option contract that the law imposes. So that's why we call it an implied option contract. Yeah, LaCanty?
Is this like the Fred, the guy that you said in the example that was gonna give money to the radio station? Is that the same thing or no?
No, because in that situation, it's not an offer for a contract, neither a unilateral nor a bilateral. It is an expression of an intent to give a gift. So there's no acceptance that really kind of comes into play in that regard. Okay. I may have gone past this, but did I see a hand? I thought I caught one out of the corner of my eye, but I didn't. Okay. All right. Now, one last part here about 87.2. Notice this last phrase here. The forbearance is binding to the extent necessary to avoid injustice. Okay? That is the purpose of this subsection. The idea here is to prevent injustice. Suppose, for instance, that Simon is a painter. This is his job. He paints barns. He does it all the time. Farmer said, hey, I want you to paint my barn white. Simon said, oh, I'm running a little low on white paint. I guess I'll go buy some to make sure I've got enough on hand when I paint Farmer's barn. If he doesn't use the paint to paint Farmer's barn, he's going to use it to paint Pig Farmer's barn in a week. Okay? He's not going to be out any money in the long run. Sure, he may have bought the paint a little earlier than he otherwise might have, but it's not going to go bad. He's still going to be able to use it. So is there really any injustice that Simon would incur in that type of a situation? Because again, this is the court saying, okay, you guys didn't talk in these terms, and you guys may not have intended to have an option contract, but we're going to impose one on your transaction. Courts are going to do that when it becomes a question of fairness, when it becomes a question of what is right for this particular situation and these parties. Let's go through a couple hypotheticals and look at how the different restatement sections and classical contract theory may or may not lead to different results. Okay, so the first one, Aunt Martha wrote to her niece Ellen, I promise to leave you Blackacre if you will live with me for the remainder of my life. Aunt Martha tried to revoke while Ellen was in the process of moving. First question, is this an offer for a unilateral or a bilateral contract? Unilateral. What does acceptance require? And what is that? Living with Aunt Martha for the rest of her life. Okay? So that's what full performance would require, which we do not have. So, under classical contract theory, can Aunt Martha successfully revoke her offer? Yes, because it has not been accepted, because there has not been full performance. So, under classical contract theory, Ellen's out of luck. Okay? What about Section 45 of the restatement? First of all, is it applicable? Why is it applicable? Because it's a unilateral contract. Section 45 is only applicable when you have an offer for a unilateral contract. under Section 45 of the restatement, can Aunt Martha successfully revoke her offer? She has not performed yet, meaning she hasn't. She is preparing to perform because she is trying to move, but she has not yet begun performance. Section 45 requires that the offeree have started performing. That's my next question. What about 87.2? First of all, is 87.2 applicable? It is. Remember, it applies in both unilateral and bilateral offers. Can Ellen be protected with an implied option contract under 87.2? Well, she's got that implied option contract that would be created. She hasn't started performing yet, but she has begun preparing to perform. Okay? It takes actually being in the house and taking care of Aunt Martha, or excuse me, at least living with Aunt Martha, to begin performance. She hasn't started performing, but she is preparing to perform, and 87.2 will protect her. Under 87.2, Aunt Martha could not revoke her offer. Okay? Now, Ellen still has to perform. Ellen still has to live with Aunt Martha for the remainder of Aunt Martha's life. It's not that she gets out of the whole thing and gets to sue Aunt Martha. She's got to perform. It's just the creation of the implied option contract that we get under 87.2. You don't like that?
That's where you come in.
Well,
For her, so she leaves.
I will say you do worry about the harmony of the household. All right, let's look at another offer. Aunt Martha wrote to her niece Ellen, "I promise to leave you Blackacre if you promise to live with me for the remainder of my life." Aunt Martha tried to revoke while Ellen was in the process of moving before she promised. First of all, is the offer for a unilateral or a bilateral contract? Now it's for a bilateral. It does say, "I promise if you promise." Okay? So what does it take to accept? It takes the promise, but we haven't had the promise yet. So we don't have any contract yet. So the question is, does Ellen have the benefit of an implied option contract under classical contract theory? Is there an implied option contract? There never is an implied option contract under classical contract theory. There never is. What about Section 45? Why not? Only unilateral contracts. This is an offer for a bilateral contract. So Section 45 is not applicable. What about under Section 87.2? Can Martha revoke? Well, we don't have acceptance because we don't have the promise. She's preparing to perform. She is, let me back out here just a moment and come back here to 87.2. She is, such action has been induced, and let's see, the offeror should reasonably expect to induce action or forbearance of a substantial character on the part of the offeree. So Ellen is preparing to move. That's pretty substantial action, pretty substantial character on Ellen's part, even though she has not yet promised, so there has not yet been acceptance. So in that situation, again, what is necessary to avoid injustice? That is under 87.2, typically going to be the imposition of that implied option contract. Okay.
Okay, so is Ellen moving in just to move in, and then after she moves in, she asks for promise? I'm confused on how this scenario.
The idea here is, let's say, for instance, that Aunt Martha sends Ellen an email saying, I promise to leave you Blackacre if you promise to live with me for the remainder of my life. Ellen gets the email, she reads it. But you know, she's got to move about an hour away. She wants to talk to her boyfriend. She wants to think about her job, which is what kind of, you know, how far she's going to have to make that hour drive in the morning, hour drive at night. Does she really want to do it? She's thinking about it. Aunt Martha, she learned, has gone on a cruise, and Aunt Martha is, you know, up in Alaska on a cruise somewhere. But while Aunt Martha's gone, Ellen can't really reach her, and she decides, yep, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. So Ellen now goes to her landlord and says, I need to get out of my lease. She goes to her job and says, hey, are there ways in which I can telecommute so that I can work from home and yet do my job? And she's making all of these plans, but she has not yet communicated her promise to Aunt Martha yet.
Oh, so before she promised, they talking about Ellen, not Aunt Martha.
Yes,
Promise.
Ellen has not promised, because Aunt Martha put the offer out there. Now it's up to Ellen to decide whether or not she wants to accept. She accepts with the promise, but she has not yet communicated that promise. She has not taken that step.
The verb is say it. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, okay.
But with the implied contract, what would be the reasonable amount of time for that to actually take effect?
It would be a reasonable amount of time.
Aunt Martha's out on whatever, a trip to Alaska hunting salmon. Like 6
Can I
months
go?
later, Alan's like, I'm gonna start moving in now.
Yeah, now that would be 6 months is going to be. I'm going to say probably going to be too long. Now I say that, you know, it may all depend on what Martha said in her communication. If let's say, for instance, Martha is in relatively good health because she's off salmon fishing, and her thought is, I'm going to need somebody living with me as I'm looking down the road 3-5 years from now. So if that's a part of the communication, then Ellen 6 months later says, I'm going to do all these things and then I'll promise. That might be okay. But if, let's say, for instance, Martha is in communication can't reach her because now she's in the hospital because her health is bad and she knows it's bad and she needs somebody right now, if you're coming, come now, 6 months is not going to be reasonable. Okay? That's all right, we won't worry about that one either. Okay, any other questions about Section 45, Section 87.2? All right, then let's talk about a different way, get out of option contracts, but talk about a different way that an offer may end. And that is when you have the death or destruction of the subject matter. Saw on the news yesterday, the day before, they got some bad wildfires in Colorado. Was it Durango? Anyway, in Colorado somewhere. So suppose that somebody has a house for sale. The offer's out there. I want to sell my house. And then, unfortunately, the house is consumed by a wildfire. Or, heaven forbid, it's a house for sale on Hawaii. I just saw something earlier today, I think it was, that Mount Kilauea is sending up a lot more lava. What if that house that is on the market for sale is destroyed by lava flow? Okay? Or you could have, because it says the death of the subject matter, what if the offer is I want to hire you to come take care of my elderly father, because he insists on living at home, but that means he needs some help. He needs somebody to come in and prepare meals and do some cleaning and do these sorts of things. So I am offering to pay you X amount of dollars per week if you will come care for my father for X number of hours each week. And unfortunately, father passes away before the offer is accepted. Okay? That's going to kill the offer. And then one last way in which an offer may die is if it is rejected. Rejection is the offeree's expression of non-acceptance, refusing the offer. No, thank you. I don't want to come take care of your father. No, thank you. I don't want to purchase your Braves hat. No, thank you. I don't want to buy your house. Rejection is effective when it is received by the offeror. Rejection is effective when it is received by the offeror. And the same ideas, the same concepts apply. Let's say, for instance, Kimberly, halfway through second half of class, decides, why in the world did I even express any interest in that nasty, sweat-stained, ugly Atlanta Braves hat? I don't want that hat because everybody knows that the Cincinnati Reds are really the team to follow. Reds are really doing bad. But anyway, so say that Kimberly decides that she's going to send the email to JC during the middle of class rejecting the offer. Okay? Again, has he opened the email? Doesn't matter. It is available to him. It is accessible to him. That is sufficient. That is the point at which the rejection has been communicated to the offeror. With rejection, because rejection does result in the death of the offer. Once rejection is effective, the offer is dead. The one exception being the option contract. Rejection does not kill an option contract. But if there's not an option contract, if the rejection is effective, that's it, offer is over with. What you also have sometimes with a rejection is a counteroffer. Now, if all you have is a counteroffer, the counteroffer typically has the effect of being a rejection. Well, no, let me rephrase that. The counteroffer is a rejection. Sometimes you may not necessarily have a counteroffer. We'll get to that later on. And this leads us into the next part of chapter 2 and the next phase of this process, which is acceptance. But one of the things that you get into here is this idea of the acceptance having to match the offer. Because if the acceptance doesn't match the offer, what you typically have is this idea of a counter offer. So if, when the dealer says, we'll sell you this Equinox for $25,000, there is the offer. Charles says, I'm willing to pay you $23,000 or $18,000 for that Equinox. Okay, that is a counteroffer. It is a rejection of the offer of $25,000. It is its own offer, which then gives the dealer the power to accept. What you get sometimes, and I don't know if this is going to work the way I want it to. We'll see. Come on. You will sometimes, oh, this may not work. You will sometimes hear this, oh, can I get volume? Ah, yes, okay. Okay, so you sometimes hear this reference to the mirror image rule, that an acceptance must mirror the offer. And anything that does not mirror the terms of the offer becomes a counteroffer. Let me explain a little bit about what you're about to watch. This particular video is, what does he call it? It's been created by a law professor at Cornell, I think. His name's Mark DeAngelis. And he has created a number of things he calls a law lesson. And he's got a lot of these law lessons. Here's his name if you want to subscribe to his channel, Mark DeAngelis. And he's got some of these that relate to contracts. This is not the only, I'm going to tell you now, this is not the only one that you will be watching over the course of this summer. There are a couple others that I like that I'm going to force you to watch. But this talks about the mirror image rule. I like these because, yes, okay, it's a little cheesy, of course it is, but he gets the concepts right. And hopefully it's just one other way in which it might help you remember this concept. So here is Professor DeAngelis's law lesson on the mirror image rule.
There's a rule of contract law that's danger for business folks to whom contract law's a stranger. Wage offer in the trade, how is acceptance made? You don't want to risk a counteroffer. Mirror image rule, mirror image rule. The language of acceptance and the offer must be the same. Any different language could be trouble. Add another term, you've got trouble. Double that common law, it's true. With additional language you're through. No acceptance here, it's counteroffer. Mirror image rule, mirror image rule. The language of acceptance and the offer must be the same. A court today will want to take a look-see. Perhaps the extra language is mere inquiry. Can you start the job today? Can you finish by the 10th of May? Is the price negotiable or a firm offer? Mirror image rule, mirror image rule. The language of acceptance and the offer must be the same. What interpretation should we give it? When implicit terms are made explicit, perhaps there is no harm. Look at substance over form, but don't forget the UCC is different. Mirror image rule, mirror image rule. The language of acceptance and the offer must be the same.
All right, yay. All right, I didn't say go back and do it over again. All right, there are a couple things here that I want to point out. Let's see, where, okay. So first of all, here, the idea at at common law is the acceptance must exactly mirror the offer. If it does not, you do not have acceptance, you have rejection. The offer dies. Because remember, we were talking about how an offer dies. We were talking about a variety of different ways in which an offer dies. One of them is with a rejection. That's the common law rule, pretty clear, pretty emphatically enforced. That being said, there is this possibility of inquiry. Okay? Let's say, for instance, that I was talking to a guy a few weeks ago, and he was selling some artwork. And he said, you know, I've got these pieces. They cost me a lot of money. I'm just trying to get rid of them. I'm trying to move them. If you want to buy a piece of artwork, one of these pieces, it's $350. Okay? Well, if I had said to him, wow, $350, can you come down off of that at all? Can you come a little lower? Okay? If I am simply looking into the possibility, is there some room for negotiation here? Or is that it? $350 that's the firm price, it's not going to change. That's not a rejection. That's just an exploration of, is there some leeway here on the terms of this offer? That is not a rejection. That is what is referred to as that idea of an inquiry. Just asking to find out if maybe, are you open to anything different? Okay? Or are you set on that $350 or whatever else the situation may be? So there does have to be some evaluation. You know, there was that part where it said, these are the inquiries. Can you start the job today? Is the price negotiable or a firm offer? That's not what I want. Where was it? That's all right. So like I said, inquiry is not going to be a rejection. It is just that. It is inquiry. That is one part to be aware of, to evaluate what it is that you have in the communication. You also have this possibility when then a response to an offer simply states what was implicit in the offer. For instance, offer to sell a home. Okay? I offer to sell you my home for $100,000. If the response is, I will purchase your home for $100,000 and good title. Okay? The idea of good title is implicit in the offer. Because who wants to buy a home when there's not good title to that piece of property? Nobody wants to buy a home only to find out, lo and behold, 3 months later, that there's somebody coming around saying, hey, this is my home. I own this piece of property. I own this building. Selling good title is just implicit in the sale of the home. By stating it, it doesn't mean it's a counteroffer. It doesn't mean it's a rejection. It's just further elucidating. It's further clarifying what was there from the very beginning. Now, whether something is mere inquiry, whether something is stating what was implicit, explicitly stating what was implicit, of course, is going to depend upon circumstances. If, for instance, I'm trying to think of maybe with, well, no, that's used. I'm trying to think of a situation where it's not necessarily clear that someone is purchasing good title. Because even when the police have auctions, they should have title cleared through them. But there are times when, you know, what is implicit, what is typically understood to be a part of that transaction, it may depend upon the circumstances. So it may be something that you have to know more about. In these type of situations, these are the things that everybody expects to go along with that transaction. In these situations, those expectations are different. So that may not necessarily be applicable to all. I'm not saying that well, but all right, there is an exercise, or a problem rather, in your textbook on page 44 that I want to take a look at, because it deals with this question of when do we have an offer, when do we have rejection, if we have rejection, when do we have revocation, if we have revocation, when do we have acceptance, if we have acceptance. And if you look at problem 2.24 or 2-24, down there starting near the bottom of the page of 44, you have communication between B&O Railroad Company and the Baltimore Rolling Mill. So we have several different pieces of communication. The first one on December 5th, from the railroad to the mill, please quote us prices for 500 to 3,000 tons, 50-pound steel rails, and for 2,000 to 5,000 tons, 50-pound iron rails. 3 days later, the mill responds, we do not make steel rails. For iron rails, we will sell 2,000 to 5,000 tons of 50-pound rails for $54 per ton. 8 days later, the railroad communicates back, please enter our order for 1,200 tons, 50-pound iron rails. 2 days later, the mill sends back communication, we cannot book your order at present for that price. So 1 day later, the railroad communicates back and says, okay, please enter an order for 2,000 tons of 50-pound iron rails. There was no response. So now, the question becomes, what is the effect of each different piece of communication? First piece, the railroad's letter on December 5th. Please quote us prices for 500 to 3,000 tons, 50-pound steel rails, and 2,000 to 5,000 tons, 50-pound iron rails. Was that preliminary negotiation, or was that an offer? Preliminary? Is anybody who think it's an offer? It is an inquiry. It's that idea of a negotiation. Please quote us the prices. It's not an offer because they don't know how much they would be required to sell. Not enough specificity to make this an offer. Okay, so we don't have an offer yet. What about the communication on the 8th? From the mill to the railroad, we do not make steel rails for iron rails, 2,000 to 5,000 tons, 50-pound rails, $54 a ton. Is that an offer? We can't have counteroffer because we don't have an offer yet. But we've got some pretty good specifics here, right? We cannot sell you steel rails. We can sell you iron rails. You asked about 2,000 to 5,000 tons of iron rails. This is how much it would cost. Okay, so we've got that specificity here, the certainty. This was determined by the court to have been an offer. Then on the 16th, the railroad responded, please enter our order for 1,200 tons of 50-pound iron rails. What is this? I've heard acceptance and counteroffer. What was the offer? 2,000 to 5,000. $54 per ton. The response was for what? $1,200 at 54 per ton over the 50-pound rails, okay? The amount's different. The weight is different. The offer said 2,000 was the lowest of the range of tons. The response was even lower. So we had an offer in that communication on, which one was it? On the 16th. That was an offer. I'm sorry, on the 8th, rather, there was an offer. But on the subsequent communication on the 16th, it's not an acceptance because the weight is different. Okay? Mirror image rule. There has not been an agreement to the terms of the offer. There has been a response with, well, let's do something different. So here on the, keep my date straight here, on the 16th, that is a rejection and a counteroffer. Okay? So if that's what we have on the 16th, then on the 18th, what is the effect of this communication? On the 18th, when the mill said, we cannot book your order at present at that price. It's a rejection of the offer that was made by the railroad on the 16th. So then, one more communication on the 19th, please enter an order for 2,000 tons of 50-pound iron rails. What is the effect of that communication? We come back to another offer. Okay? We had an inquiry, we had an offer, we had a rejection with a counteroffer, we had a rejection to the counteroffer, and now we have another offer. Okay? It may seem sometimes like splitting hairs. When you have an offer, you have a counteroffer, what have we got? But it's important to understand, because remember, a counteroffer is a rejection. It kills the original offer if you don't have an option on there. So it's important to understand, to figure out what the communication, the effect of the communication, to figure out, first of all, do we have a contract? And if so, at what point was the contract formed? Because that's what you have to know in order to understand the terms of the contract. Okay, any questions about that one? All right, that's a good place to stop to take our break. Then we'll come back and we'll look at acceptances more specifically.